In 2020, AmCham and the Alliance had your back.
What's the foundation for everything for us globally?
Creating new opportunities here in Australia.
America is the biggest investor in Australia by a country mile. It's enormous. 27% of all foreign investment in Australia comes from the United States.
An extraordinary example of companies, whether Chevron, whether Boeing, 3M, Coca-Cola, investing in our country and making us a stronger people committed to common ideas.
And in the United States.
If you can make it there, you can make it anywhere because it is so tough.
We have active contracts to build 33 large vessels for the United States Navy. That's nearly 15% of the entire US Navy, which would have been built by Austal.
Connecting trusted partners.
That trust between the two nations is really what provides us the opportunity to share the technical capabilities we have.
So there's great advantage for Australia and the United States to share information founded on that basis of trust that has been built over many decades.
To strengthen and build our economy.
In order to get the resources out of the ground, in order to build the infrastructure, in order to fund everyday Australians' homes and credit cards. It's American investment that helps to make that happen.
This year, we're excited to bring AmCham members new opportunities.
We punch above our weight, and we're damn good at it.
Listen to their candid views.
Australia's tough, very, very tough. I mean, you've got to be, the winner of the gold medal at the Olympics just to survive in business in Australia, and particularly in manufacturing. If you want an example of that, look no further than energy.
For people and companies to want to invest in Australia, it is very important we make our country attractive to investment. And I don't think we're doing this enough.
At some stage, the US needs to embark on a much more significant investment into infrastructure, and public-private partnerships are a key model to do that.
And celebrate the 70th anniversary of the ANZUS Treaty.
After a crisis like this, countries are going to become more nationalistic, and the trusted friends and partners, the allies that we have, are going to be essential in rebuilding the economies.
Watch what AmCham brings in 2021.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is April Palmerley, and I'm the CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce in Australia. Really glad that you could be with us today for our special Live from America webinar. We are partnering with AmCham New Zealand and the US Chamber of Commerce today, so welcome to everyone joining us from all different parts of the world. I know that we all bounce around a lot, around a lot of different platforms, so just a reminder that we're on Zoom this morning. And if you have a question to ask at any time, just move your cursor down to the bottom of the screen, click on the Q&A box, and you can type your question in there. And then when we get to the portion where we have the discussion, I'll refer to the questions in the Q&A box to put to the panelists. I'd like to acknowledge the following AmCham governors from Australia who are on the webinar today. Chris LeBlanc from 3M, Peter McKeon from Excelsior College, Sam Maresh from GE, Professor Pascal Quester from Swinburne University, Fred Chilton from Toomey Peg Lawyers, and Linda Brown from Torrens University. I'd also like to welcome AmCham New Zealand directors, Jonathan Reed from VMG Ventures and Peter Kane from Pfizer. I'd now like to hand over to Mike Hearn, the Executive Director of AmCham New Zealand, to introduce the participants today. Mike.
Thank you, April. Delighted to be working with you again and your great team, and a privilege to be able to introduce this great panel. The first presenter is going to be Jim Caruso, a senior advisor with the Asia-focused strategic advisory firm of Bauer Group Asia. Prior to joining BGA, he was a senior foreign policy advisor to the US Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii. Earlier, Jim served as Deputy Chief of Mission and Charge d'Affaires at the US Embassy in Canberra, Australia. He also worked as the Charge d'Affaires at the US Mission to the Association of Southeastern Nations in Jakarta. Our second speaker is Zoe Daniel, who spent almost 3 decades on the front line of news and current events in Australia and internationally. She translated the election of Donald Trump for Australians. Interesting challenge. Zoe is a 3-time foreign correspondent and a former ABC News Washington bureau chief. Then we have Senator Stephen Lucey, who served in the Australian Parliament during the Hawke and Keating governments, where he chaired both the Joint Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade and the Senate Regulation Committee. Prior to his Senate service, Stephen was the General Secretary of the NSW branch of the Australian Labor Party. He also served a term as the ALP National President. Stephen Lucy is now the Deputy Chair of Thales Australia. I'll now hand back to April, who will be moderating the discussion.
Thanks, Mike. So the format today is we're going to hear from each of our panelists briefly, and then we'll engage in a short discussion among the panelists, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience. So it looks like we're going to go in alphabetical order today. We'll start with Jim Caruso coming to us from New York. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, April. Thanks, Mike. Great to be here. All right, I'm going to talk about the situation in the U.S. in less than 5 minutes, which is a challenge, and I'll look forward to our discussion. But I'll begin with COVID, because everything begins with COVID for the past year and a half. And as you probably know, in the US earlier, our northern summer, things were getting pretty good. We've had more than 50% of people fully vaccinated. Caseload was going down, infection rates were going down. And then, of course, Delta struck over the past month. And now we have lack of hospital beds in states that are largely unvaccinated or much less vaccinated, like Florida and Texas, and even states like Maryland and Virginia, which have more vaccinated individuals. Caseloads went from 2 to 3 a day to 22 to 24 a day. So clearly this is going to have an impact. And I would say these numbers are probably low because testing fatigue and just people tired of the whole thing, probably the number of cases are higher of infections, even as hospital cases in highly vaccinated areas like mine are staying relatively stable, a little higher. The situation is such that the USG is going to announce booster shots for people, starting with healthcare workers and people with health problems, probably starting in tomorrow or the next day, for 8 months after the initial series of vaccinations was completed. So these so-called boosters, it's hoped, will take care of so-called breakthrough infections from Delta. Now, the issue related to the economy and politics as a whole from COVID, there are a couple of aspects. One is consumers, as they came out of COVID, were spending like crazy. Consumer confidence was high. People had saved up a lot of money from not going out to restaurants, as well as from stimulus packages that the government provided, not to mention the incredibly easy monetary policy of the Fed. So spending was going crazy, and we see some result of that in relatively high inflation numbers. Although this is also caused by strains of the supply chain. Supply chains were really stretched from COVID, as you probably know. Shipping rates have gone through the roof. So the Baltic Dry Index, which is a measure of shipping rates, has doubled from July 2019 to July of this year. Similarly, chip shortages have caused a spike in price and lack of availability of automobiles. And we're busy remodeling a home here. And anything you want to order, from lumber to kitchen cabinets to appliances, are on back order. Again, both as a result of supply problems and demand problems. Now demand apparently is sinking pretty fast, caused probably of the COVID issue. How does this play elsewhere is the concern people have about COVID after being told you get the vaccination and you're done, and now you're being told you need a booster, is already US confidence in institutions and experts, which has been low, is getting another hit. And this is further exacerbated by what's going on, of course, in Afghanistan. This plays into the politics of who knows anything. What is truth? What are the facts? And so the 2022 midterm elections are going to be a very interesting test of whether the relative competence as seen by the Democrats of the Biden administration, or the full-throated confidence that Trump tried to put forward, who's going to come out on top of that? I will say this about confidence, however. Restaurants remain full. People don't talk about politics a lot that I've seen in my little neck of the woods. And maybe the choice is going to be more existential. Climate change issues, infrastructure issues, debt issues, China issues, pandemic issues. Which party, which individuals are going to be able to take care of those things? And it's going to be a knockdown, drag-out fight in Congress over the next year and a half until the elections. The good news is the infrastructure package has passed the Senate. It should pass the House. This is the first infrastructure package that we've gotten through in years. And starting from Obama's first term, they were trying to do that. So this shows that there is possibility of bipartisan cooperation. There's bipartisan cooperation about competition with China. There's largely bipartisan cooperation about working with allies like Australia. But beyond that, it's pretty tough. And this is all, of course, exacerbated by social media getting ever more vociferous and traditional media becoming ever less meaningful in people's lives. So that's my 5-minute spiel. I look forward to a further discussion. Thanks all.
Thanks, Jim. That was fantastic. Now I'm going to turn to Zoe Daniel. Over to you.
Thanks, April. Thanks, Jim. It's great to be here, everyone. Look, I'll just talk briefly off the back of what Jim has had to say, and I think perhaps a reasonable starting point is to sort of wind back to before the 2020 election, where if you had asked me 12 months out from that, I would have said that Donald Trump was walking into a second term in office. And in fact, I recall saying to a couple of friends at the time, of course, that could change if there's some sort of cataclysmic global event or event affecting America. And in that context, I was perhaps referencing the prospect of a major natural disaster or a terrorist attack or something of that ilk, certainly not foreseeing a global pandemic. But as history will show, pandemic has since played out, fundamentally affecting Donald Trump's capacity to win that election and in effect, in my mind, inserting Joe Biden into office. I guess the question that I've had since 2020 and the election and also the events that played out, of course, in January of this year is just how long Joe Biden can sustain the wave that put him into office, which in my mind was not entirely, of course, but in the end, COVID-based. Perhaps if not for COVID, we would have faced a tight election anyway because of Donald Trump's, shall I call it, mercurial behaviour as president and general unpredictability. But of course, we know that he has a rusted on base of voters that would have voted for him no matter what. So my question was always just how motivated would Democrats have been to go to the voting booths if not for COVID? And I think that as we see what's happening in Afghanistan play out, in many ways, we're seeing the beginning of that challenge to Biden on just how long he can ride the positive response to his administration based on being able to manage the pandemic crisis, being able to roll out an effective vaccination program, and being able to get the country moving again. And I note, much as having covered the 2016 election, I have deep suspicion of polls, but I note the polling over the last couple of months, which is quite interesting in regard to Biden, in the sense that his approvals were already slipping even prior to what we're seeing play out in Afghanistan right now. And in the last few days, his approvals have fallen to the lowest level in his presidency. You also have 54+% of Americans, according to some polls, saying that the nation is on the wrong track. So although only 1 in 5 people in the US who were surveyed thought that the United States should not pull out of Afghanistan, there's a question of just how this has been managed and whether it erodes that carefully crafted and not unjustified image of Joe Biden as the elder statesman, the adult in the room, to have this, what has become, much as it's people's lives in Afghanistan and it's about people, but a massive media and social media event, because we see it playing out on our television screens and on our social media feeds. And it's drawn attention, I think, from rank and file Americans back to Afghanistan, when surveys would show previously that people didn't rate it among their top issues. So it's drawn attention to the Biden administration in a very negative way. And it's also given Donald Trump and Republicans an opportunity to find a chink in the armor of the Biden administration. And we know that Donald Trump is very expert at finding weakness. I always felt that even with his nicknames for people that he very expertly deployed during 2016 and also during his administration, things like Lying Ted for Ted Cruz, Little Marco and others, that he was very expert at finding the pain point with his opponents and twisting the knife there to bring attention back to himself and his own agenda. And this situation in Afghanistan has given him an opportunity to do that. So I think now you have a test of the Biden administration. Firstly, is there anything they can do now that this pull out of Afghanistan, much as it was broadly supported, but the exit has gone so awry? Is there anything they can do to try to mitigate that now? And then secondly, how do you keep the focus on infrastructure spending, social programs, the vaccination program, the management of COVID to sustain through until the midterm elections? And then there's just some sort of basic life questions. And one that strikes me, just looking at my own social media from my friends in the US even today, is kids going back to school. You know, this is a symbol of life returning to normal. And in a situation where we have Delta, just how long that sense of normality can be sustained. So in the context of what Jim said, sort of looking forward to the midterms and also 2024, for me, it's a question of just how much concrete policy making the Biden administration can do that actually makes a difference to people, and how much can they keep the focus on that going forward.
Thanks very much, Zoe. And now we'll hear from Stephen Loosley.
Thank you, April. I won't traverse the issues that Jim and Zoe have dealt with so comprehensively, and in very large measure I agree with their observations. I just wanted to put the Biden administration in context through a story I was told from someone in Washington, fairly senior in the administration, just the other day. And in the third week of January this year, this person had to go to the White House to meet the president for the first time. And to do that, he was taken in a US Army armoured personnel carrier across town through multiple checkpoints manned by the men and women of various National Guard units still on duty in the wake of January the 6th. And I thought to myself after I heard this story, and I've no doubt this gentleman was telling the truth, this is a Washington, DC, more bitterly divided and subject to tension than at any time since Abraham Lincoln slipped in disguise, accompanied only by a detective named Pinkerton, from Baltimore to Washington in 1861. So it's quite remarkable some of the things that have happened in an improved environment. Jim made mention of the infrastructure bill. I see that as a landmark in terms of what's been achieved. A level of bipartisanship in the Senate, which will be reflected ultimately in a House vote to put the infrastructure spending into play. There's no question that COVID is the dominant domestic issue. And with the surge of the Delta strain, there are challenges for this administration, but there's no question either that Donald Trump was found wanting by many millions of American voters for the inconsistent manner in which his administration addressed the COVID outbreak. Now, on a very positive note from an Australian perspective, and this is actually reflected in a very recent United States Senate resolution on the value of ANZUS to America, a bipartisan resolution supported across the aisle, noting the significance of ANZUS after 70 years. And that's particularly significant as there are research reports in both the US and Australia that point to the simple fact that most treaties endure for about 40 years maximum. But in our part of the world, ANZUS has endured and has been a bedrock of Australian and US foreign and defence policy in this part of the world. We're very fortunate, and I think Jim alluded to this too, the consensus that exists in the administration and in the Congress on how to manage relations with Beijing. And this was most graphically illustrated with the discussions with the Secretary of State, with Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and their respective Chinese interlocutors in Anchorage. China is acutely sensitive to the fact, and they will say this, they have said it bluntly to Australian military personnel on exchanges and on discussions in various fora that China has no friends and has effectively no allies, whereas in the Australian context, we have allies and partners and friends, particularly the US. So when Anthony Blinken spoke up for Australia, which has been under a good deal of economic pressure from China, economic coercion is probably the best expression, the Chinese objected to that. And of course, as everyone's aware, the Secretary of State said simply, well, Australia's an ally, of course you'd expect us to speak up for them. And that's been a consistent message coming from the administration, and this has been the most positive approach to American allies in different parts of the world since James Mattis assumed the Secretary of Defence role in the Trump administration. It had been missing in the last year or two of the Trump administration, but in Europe with NATO, in Japan and Korea and Australia and elsewhere, the administration has sought to rebuild relations with the traditional allies and to have a common approach. And that brings me to a brief observation about the Quad. It seems truly bizarre that Beijing wants to have an argument with all of its neighbours, from Japan and Korea through to the Philippines and Vietnam, even Indonesia, Australia certainly, and India. And that's really breathed new life into the Quad, because the country that has turned the corner on the Quad is India. And that's because of the tensions in the Himalayas in particular. So it's going to be interesting to see how the Quad evolves into the future. I trust it won't simply become a bureaucratic secretariat and so on and so forth, but it will be purpose-based. Everything from disaster relief and humanitarian missions through to security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. There's no question that recent events in Afghanistan have shaken American allies. I'm thinking particularly of the Gulf states and the Saudis, because what's happened in Kabul the last day or two will reinforce the commitment of every mujahideen just about everywhere to stay in the fight. Having said this, it's not a one-way street. The most critical media on the Taliban outside the traditional Western democracies is to be found in Moscow. And if you look at publications like Izvestia, given the Soviet experience 1979 to 1989, the Russians quite legitimately are very concerned about a militant Islamist regime in Kabul that has an impact across the border in some of the stans, some of the Muslim republics of the old Soviet Union. So there's impact. Now, the question that is being asked now explains our failure, US, Australian, other allies' failure in Afghanistan, because people are still asking what was the strategy? Why were we there? And yes, to destroy Al-Qaeda, and yes, to deny terrorists a base. But we never really came to grips with whether or not we were nation building and what sort of a government we wish to see grow organically in Kabul. And if anyone is familiar with Francis Fitzgerald's brilliant analysis of the Vietnamese War, Fire in the Lake, for which she won a Pulitzer, if you read her analysis of the American stroke Western view of Vietnam, you could take out Vietnam and insert Afghanistan in terms of some of the mistakes that were made. The midterms loom very large in the US. There's no question about that in terms of the Senate and the House. Donald Trump, very active. He gives interviews in the lobby of his resort at Mar-a-Lago, and even gave an interview to the authors of I Alone Can Fix It, who wrote the definitive, very stable genius, Phil Rucker and Carol Loningan, just recently. An hour was set aside for the interview. He spoke for 2.5 hours straight. And he enjoys the fact that people come up to him all the time and chat to him, want to shake his hand. And he took his journalistic visitors from the Washington Post out onto the terrace to have dinner. And he enjoyed the fact that everyone stood and applauded him. As one commentator observed, this is Donald Trump's own private brigadoon. But he remains active, and he looks not only to the midterms beyond, which is going to have a fascinating impact upon the turnout next year and well beyond. I'll finish on this note, April, from an Australian perspective. When Scott Morrison was told that Donald Trump had lost the election, of course, in American politics, from Arizona to Georgia, it's still working its way through various audits and new voter suppression laws, which the president describes as Jim Crow on steroids. When Scott Morrison was told Donald Trump was defeated, he simply said, "That's over." Now, it may or may not be over for the future, and dealing with the Biden administration from an Australian perspective is certainly more readily achieved. The administration is more traditional, it's more consistent, and we don't have to wake up in the morning and see what the latest tweet happens to be. As National Security Director Dan Coates, complained once in Sydney that he'd be up at 2 or 3 a.m. seeing what the White House tweeting was bringing by way of a policy change. I think we can be optimistic about America in spite of recent events. The alliance is very solid, and our relationship at different levels is very strong and probably needs to be reinforced with an economic strategy element. And we should be looking to do that with the Europeans as well. I don't know what the latest is in Washington, DC. Jim may be much closer to this than we can be, but I am told Carolyn Kennedy is interested in being ambassador, and the president is well disposed. She was a very early supporter. And Prime Minister Menzies put it best in conversation with President Johnson. He said, there's only one qualification for a US ambassador to Australia, and that's to be able to pick up the phone and talk directly to the president. And Ms. Kennedy certainly can do that. So let's hope that ends well and we don't have another Harris situation. But I remain optimistic. I like it when the president said a lot of people lose when they bet against the US, and I think that remains the case.
Thank you, Stephen. You mentioned Caroline Kennedy. I was thinking how many of the questions I want to ask actually start with a C: China, COVID, climate, Caroline Kennedy, cyber, the celebration of the 70th anniversary, which I gather Prime Minister Morrison may not go to America to do at this point. Cuomo, the Quad, well, Quad's not a C, but alliteration. But we have so many good questions coming through from our members. I might just put myself on the back burner for the moment and go directly to some of the questions that have come up while you all have been speaking. Russell asked us about the infrastructure bill. Obviously, the House Democrats are not of one mind on the infrastructure bill. What do you think the chances are of a quick passage of the bill? And if not quick, what do you think the timeline will likely be? Jim, you're sitting in the US. What's your view on the passage of the infrastructure bill?
I think it's very likely to pass. Look, in Congress, congressmen look for opportunities to get heard. And this being such an important project, this was another opportunity for certain Congress people to make their points known. But Chairperson Pelosi will knock some heads together. I'm sure some promises will be made regarding an additional bill that's going to be coming out that's more on social welfare spending. And I think that's actually what this is about as far as the Democrats are concerned. I also think a lot of Republicans may end up voting for it because the last thing they want to do is not get part of the benefits from this bill for their districts. So I think this will happen before the end of the year.
Yeah, well, in fact, we saw 18 Republicans vote against the filibuster to allow the bill through in the Senate. So I think that Stephen's comment about it being a bipartisan effort is spot on, but the divisiveness of what's happening within the Republican Party is notable. Let's move to Fred Chilton. To what extent will the impact of Delta change the anti-vaccination approach of the governors of Florida and Texas? Zoe, do you have a view on the differences in the United States? I think Australians realize that California, Florida, Texas, some of our biggest states have a very different approach to how they're dealing with the virus.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see that play out because of the way that it's being framed by the leadership in the various states. And I think I did see that the Texas governor now has COVID. So, you know, does that change public sentiment? Well, you know, it's a question around how that's reported in the media that people are consuming. You know, I think public messaging is a huge deal in the COVID crisis that we're in, and people tend to respond, and it's the same in Australia, to lockdowns, testing, vaccination programs, depending on the messaging that they're receiving, and a lot of that's to do with the media that they consume. I mean, I think it's becoming sort of scientifically self-evident that we are headed for a pandemic of the unvaccinated, and that's going to become abundantly clear just because of who's in the hospital, who's getting sick and who's dying. So does that in and of itself shift sentiment among people who are vaccine hesitant in those states? Well, you know, you can only hope. But I do think that America and Australia are very different in this context, in the sense of, you know, personal rights are held very close by Americans, I think, in a different way to how they are by Australians. Not to say that Australians aren't keen to have their rights sort of front and centre, but I think that there is a different culture around telling people what to do. And I think that's different in different states. You know, I always felt when I was living there that, and covering the US, having traveled to 44 states in 4.5 years, that it was actually like covering lots of different countries. And I think you have your regions, you know, you have the New England, the Northeast, the South, the Deep South. Texas is a country, California is a country, you know, the Midwest, like they're culturally very different. And therefore the way that the messaging is received by those people and what they choose to consume in a media context is different. And, you know, without going on and on, April, I do think that I'm no longer a working journalist, but obviously was a journalist for 3 decades. And I think it's very much incumbent on us as journalists and media organisations to have a sense of responsibility about the information that we're putting out right now, because that can swing entire populations one or other direction on things like vaccination. And that's a huge responsibility to bear, and something that perhaps we'll look back on in 20 years and say, well, isn't that interesting? Those people were consuming a particular kind of media messaging, and then look at the death toll in that area.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. You look at Florida and the population is similar to Australia, obviously. It's a country in and of itself. I think that to your point about Americans and Australians being different, the best explanation I've heard was from Kim Beasley, who said the leitmotif for Australia, if you had to choose one word to describe the Australian psyche, it would be fairness. Whereas for Americans, the word would be freedom. Right. And I think that's what you're talking about, the difference in the individual rights. We certainly saw, you know, George Christensen making comments here in Australia. It's not just journalists that are being watched in terms of what they say about the effectiveness of masks and vaccinations, but the social media platforms are the big ones that we're looking at. Stephen, let me just turn to you. How do you see the evolution of the US-China relationship and its impact on Australia, Japan, the other Indo-Pacific partners and allies in the region?
Very much governed by the attitude which Beijing continues to embrace, whether it's the wolf warrior style that's been popularized by Zhao Lijiang from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, or a more even tempered, deliberate approach. It's very difficult to imagine a situation in which any country can be at diplomatic loggerheads with Scandinavia, Canada and Australia simultaneously. But the Chinese have managed to achieve that essentially for the same reasons, ranging from foreign interference to hostage diplomacy. So I think Anthony Blinken put it fairly well around the time of the Anchorage meeting. Look to cooperate where it's possible, to collaborate where appropriate, and to draw the distinction where it's necessary. And that's certainly what Australia needs to do, to be vigorous in our diplomacy and very robust in our democratic discussion here at home and abroad, and to build some new bridges, particularly in the South Pacific and with the ASEAN countries. The Quad is going to be quite fascinating as it evolves in a parallel track to ANZUS, I suspect. A suggestion was made recently, which I liked, and that the countries of the Quad ought to look for ways to cooperate more closely in matters of economic strategy with the EU and some of the technology areas and the like. That's a very, very useful response. Now, could I just make one plea to our American friends, and that is the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as it has evolved. We ought not to look back and see an American failure to join the TPP as being the equivalent of Henry Cabot Lodge denying American membership of the League of Nations in 1919, 1920. The TPP can be an extremely valuable strategic as well as economic vehicle in terms of relations in the Asia Pacific and eventually in the Indo-Pacific. And that's something that's difficult for the Congress to address, but it really is of critical significance in terms of relations with all the countries of this region, beginning with Japan and Korea through ASEAN to Australia. And I think the TPP, I know it's on the agenda for our embassy in Washington constantly. I trust it does come back onto the congressional agenda quite seriously.
Let's turn to Jim to respond to that.
Thanks, April. So, you know, Vice President Harris is going to Vietnam and Singapore later this week. And the expectation is in Singapore, she'll make a major policy speech about trade. What it seems to be is that the U.S. is going to look to sign on to the digital economy agreement that exists between Australia and Singapore, and maybe turn that into, if not a TPP, at least a regional agreement that will cover a good chunk of digital trade and rules for cyber going forward. Politically, domestically, TPP is not something the Biden administration is going to take on anytime soon. Just not going to happen. And just one more thing about China. You know, the gloves are off. They went into Hong Kong, threw a bunch of people in jail, and made no bones that Hong Kong is just another city in China. A. B. They're taking down their biggest winners of the economy. Their tech companies are now being told, you're going to follow CCP rules. CCP members are going to sit on your board of directors and make sure you get out of line. And if you raise your head up like Jack Ma did and criticize us, we're going to take you down hard. So clearly, the authoritarian tendencies are only growing stronger. And the question for the rest of us is how do we respond?
Good point. One of the fun things about Zoom is that you can ask questions anonymously. It's not like we're in the room and you have to stand up and state your name. So we have one provocative question that I might throw to Zoe in the first instance. Do you believe that the Biden administration can repair the severe damage done to trust in America's willingness to stand up for allies after the disaster that was the Trump administration?
Well, it's interesting. I was just thinking about that in the context of the conversation between Stephen and Jim about China and the sort of Asia focus currently. When Joe Biden was elected and sort of in the lead up to the 2020 election, there was some discussion about what direction the Democrats would be facing when it came to foreign policy. And there is a sort of thesis that's put forward that Democrats are more Atlantic focused and Republicans are more Pacific focused. And therefore, would that be to the detriment of Australia if the Democrats were entirely focused on repairing relationships with the Europeans because of the various interactions between Donald Trump and European leaders, and also the fragmentation of NATO? And I guess I feel that events are simply dictating in many ways that the administration remains focused in this direction. And that's a positive for Australia. You know, China is so central to every conversation that we're having right now. And that innately creates a synergy between us. The Pacific also, which much as there is talk about Pacific nations and their importance in a sort of geopolitical context, there's a lot more work and opportunity there, which again, Australia can be part of with the United States. And then even what's unfolding in Afghanistan, much as it's disastrous, it ties us together. So it creates an opportunity for Australia to be in the room with a democratic administration, which may have been in other circumstances otherwise focused on trying to sort out the erosion of those relationships with the Germans, for example, and others. But I would say too that although Donald Trump was, you know, very blunt and in some ways or in some circumstances offensive in his language towards leaders of particular countries to get what he wanted, to push his America First agenda, to be seen to be that tough guy on the global stage, underneath all of that, the relationships were still continuing, obviously, between the various diplomats, between the various defence forces, between the various countries. So, you know, if you talk to people in defence in Australia who deal with US defence, they would say that those relationships are stronger than ever in many ways. And perhaps they put in more effort to sustain those relationships because of what was going on in the White House. So can it be repaired? Well, yes, because Joe Biden's a totally different personality. And I think there's a sense of relief, perhaps, in the leadership of those various nations that were going head to head with Donald Trump to have a more traditional style of interaction with the US. But also underlying that, perhaps there's less damage to those ongoing relationships than you would think, especially given that Donald Trump was a one-term president. If he's re-elected in 2024, well, that's a different situation altogether.
And that certainly is a message that Jim gave repeatedly when he was chief of mission here in Australia, that the relationship between our countries is much more than the individual who's in the White House or even in the lodge here in Australia. It's a much more people-to-people relationship. The other thing about what you said about Democrats versus Republicans, I know in the beginning of the Biden administration, we did assume that with so many people from the second Obama administration coming in, they would be more Atlanticists. But Biden has appointed even fewer people than Trump did. I mean, he's way down on Obama or Bush. Very, very few people have been appointed. So it's kind of hard for us to really know which direction they're going to be facing. I think I don't know if Jim or Stephen has any information on how quickly more nominations are going to come through. But let me quickly go to Stephen, because we do have a couple of questions here about the UK and the EU. What economic development do you think is needed for the Indo-Pacific? You know, specifically, what kind of a role for the EU, Stephen?
I think in the technology area, in the connectivity, there is a role for the UK, for the EU, for the US and Australia. And we've seen some of that discussed and then elevated to policy decisions in the not too distant past, in terms of the undersea cables, in terms of the electrification program in Papua New Guinea. So you have that as a basic step. Transportation links flow off that, and Australia needs to do more in terms of offering employment opportunities in the South Pacific. No question in my mind that's achievable. In terms of what the European powers are endeavouring to do of very recent times, we've seen that with Britain, with France to a lesser extent with Germany, is to have an effective presence in the region, and to let potential adversaries know that European powers have an interest in the outcome of some of the disputes. I think it's a great irony, but a positive one, that Australia supposedly went to war with the US in Vietnam to hold, in Prime Minister Menzies' words, the downward thrust of Chinese communism. One of the great bulwarks against Chinese communism is, of course, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And the Navy that is back in Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam is the United States Navy. So there are interesting twists and turns strategically. It's important to look at the strategic needs and then to fill out, wherever possible, what the economic and social needs are. Now, in that respect, climate change looms very large, particularly for our South Pacific neighbours, and the necessity of generating energy from different sources, which both Australia and the US, and not to mention the EU, are very well adept at contributing to those kinds of outcome, from wind and solar through to hydrogen. So those issues come to mind, April. we don't have an overall economic strategy at the moment. I think we need to define one, beginning with the US, and then looking at other partners for cooperation.
I'm surprised that we're 50 minutes into the webinar, and that's the first time we've touched on climate change seriously. It's a big issue. It's the center of the national security strategy for the US, and we have COP26 coming up. But just to pull on the string a little bit further, we have a question from John Keogh that I might put to Jim. What do you think the US response would be to an invasion by China of Taiwan?
You can tell John's a journalist for asking a question like that. Look, that's going to be up to one person. That's the person sitting in the Oval Office. You know, that's all I can tell you.
What do you think the likelihood is?
That's up to a fellow sitting on the other side of the ocean. You know, she's made it clear that by the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party's founding, he wants Taiwan be brought back in. That's, I believe, 2049. Actually, not the founding of the Chinese state. I think something will happen before then to make it happen. I think the PRC activity in Hong Kong and Xinjiang has made it clear to every Taiwanese what being absorbed would mean. That's any sort of autonomy is not going to happen. There will be no two countries, one system. I'm sorry, one country, two systems. So the only way they can take it is by force. And if they do that, I think the ambiguity of what the US may do is going to be the most useful thing right now for the US.
Okay, you haven't lost your diplomacy skills. Just in these last couple of minutes, given that any of us who were asked 5 years ago, where do you see yourself in 5 years, would have gotten that wrong. Let me just ask you quickly for prediction. Since Zoe mentioned that she did at least put a caveat in her assumption that Trump could get a second term, she had a caveat unless. Are there any things that you see on the horizon that we should be looking out for? I'll start with you, Zoe.
Well, look, let me just rewind that a tiny bit, just to come off the back of what Jim and Stephen just said. I think right now, the entire world is still kind of just focused on COVID. That's really the only thing that's happening for everyone in most countries. And positive and negative things can happen under the cover of COVID. So does it provide an opportunity for China to flex its muscles by stepping into Taiwan, for example, because the rest of the world would find it very difficult to respond to that in the current context, just because of everything else we're grappling with. But then on the other side of that, on climate, which to me is the sort of big underlying issue that is just bubbling along, not getting enough attention because of COVID, it provides an opportunity for an administration like the Biden administration and also governments in other countries to actually take positive steps to make changes. And harking back to that kernel of the conversation about the Democrats and the infrastructure bill, you know, it occurs to me that from a Democrat perspective, that needs to be handled very carefully, because I think people are just so sick of gridlock and intransigence, and even more starkly in a time of COVID where, you know, life and death has become very real for a lot of people. We're living in a very fragile environment. So from that perspective, there was a sense of how refreshing it was when Joe Biden was elected and actually started doing things rather than just arguing about it. There was, you know, action on COVID, action on vaccines, infrastructure, various other things. So, you know, to try to take a positive spin on the 5-year outlook, I guess what I'm trying to say is COVID provides an opportunity for cataclysmic change around the world in the way that we do things, in the way that we approach things, in the changes that we make, in the policy failures and gaps that have been seen through this pandemic, to actually step into that space and try to move things forward to make things better, rather than coming out of the pandemic and just reverting to where we were all at before. Because I think the pandemic has provided an opportunity for some reflection on the direction in which we're all going, both in our sort of personal working lives and also in a global policy and government context. So, you know, without sort of making that big prediction of, well, will Donald Trump be elected in 2024, and are we going to go back to that really sort of interesting, relentless time? I would only say opportunity knocks.
We just have to seize it. Absolutely. It doesn't pick the lock. Stephen, do you have a prediction for us or an outlook?
April, I'm always comforted by Winston Churchill's observation that the future is unknowable, but the past is of some comfort. So if we look at the state of play and how many predictions fall down routinely, all I'll say is this, that I think the second Cold War, in which we are enmeshed at the moment, becomes more and more an argument about values. We've seen arguments about economy. A great many countries, including Australia and the US, are seeking to diversify everything from markets to supply chains. And I think overwhelmingly, the debate with China and the other authoritarians, such as the Russians, will be more and more about values. And that's important for our constituencies, our constituencies in the US and Australia and elsewhere. So that's my prediction. I'm, of course, alert to the fact that if predictions were right, there would have been a Labor government elected in this country just a couple of years ago. And I think work on the basis of the balance of probabilities. I think a democratic debate in which Australia, the US and other countries are very robust in asserting our core commitments is healthy, and I think has an enormous spin-off well beyond our shores.
Your comment about our values reminds me of the late Senator John McCain when he visited the Australian War Memorial. He said to Dr. Brendan Nelson, "Our interests are our values." And Dr. Nelson responded, "And our values are our interests." I think that's still very true today. Jim, we will just go to you to give us your final words, and thank you for staying up late to join us early in the morning here before I turn over to Chris for the vote of thanks.
Well, you know, Stephen quotes Winston Churchill. I'll quote Yogi Berra, who said, it's really tough to make predictions, especially about the future. But, you know, there are a couple of things that really struck me. As you read annual reports this year from corporations all around the world, every single one has something about what they're doing about climate change and what they're doing about diversity in the workforce. Every single one. And when you see that, you know that it's the train is leaving the station. It has momentum. It's exacerbated by the pandemic, where people who try to deny science comes back and bites them. So I think, as Zoe said, there's hope here that some good may come out of this disaster the past year and a half. And real efforts are going to be made towards climate change, reduction of income inequality, dealing with authoritarian regimes who are trying to take down our democracies from within. And my last prediction is Pete Buttigieg will be the Democratic candidate.
Oh, that was worth waiting till the last minute for.
We'll talk again.
A cliffhanger. Okay, now I'd like to turn to Chris LeBlanc, one of our governors in New South Wales and a premium member of the Chamber, to offer a vote of thanks. Chris?
Thank you, April. First, I hope that all of you and your families are doing okay throughout the lockdowns for those that are impacted, and that in general you remain resilient in these challenging times. And talking about challenging times, wow, what an interesting discussion on the first year of the Biden-Harris administration. Interestingly, this year, 3M Australia is also celebrating 70 years in the country, which coincides with the 70-year alliance treaty between the US and Australia. Throughout these times, we have seen multiple administrations go through, but something that has always remained strong is that bond, that collaboration between Australia and the US. Two very similar societies located in two distant corners of the planet, but linked by similar values, similar way of life, and common interest. Throughout the discussion, I particularly noted the impact that the pandemic and the Delta variants continues to have in our societies, not only in the way that we live, but also the way that organizations are having to adapt in order to survive and continue operating. We are living throughout unprecedented times, and socio-politic conditions in the US are definitely reflecting this. It was a privilege to hear James Caruso, a former charge d'affaires US Embassy in Canberra, Zoe Daniel, 3 times ABC foreign correspondent and former Washington Bureau chief, and Stephen Loosley, member of the Order of Australia, former ALP national president and senator. I am sure all on the webinar will agree that it was an insightful discussion today. Thank you again. Stay safe and stay connected.